Picture a 1965 Dodge Coronet sitting on the starting line at a quarter-mile drag strip somewhere in Southern California in the spring of 1965. The car looks wrong. Not damaged wrong, not crashed wrong, but wrong in a way that makes you tilt your head and squint at it. The front wheels have been shoved forward almost a foot up under where the front bumper should be. The rear wheels have been pulled forward more than that. The whole body sits on top of these relocated wheels like somebody took a stock Coronet and slid the entire chassis backward underneath it. People walking by the pit stop and stare. A few of them laugh. One of them tells the guy standing next to the car that he ought to take it back to the shop and have somebody put it together right. The guy standing next to the car is wearing a pressed white jacket, white pants, white tennis shoes, and he is chewing on an unlit cigar. He nods politely. Then the run starts. The Hemi lights up and that wrong-looking Coronet stands up on its rear bumper, front wheels pawing at the sky, and runs a 9.52 at over 143 miles per hour. The guy in the white jacket was Dick Landy. The car that looked broken was the fastest door slammer in the country. And the reason both of those things are true is the entire story I want to tell you today. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the engineers, the racers, and the builders who rewrote the rules of American motorsport before most of us were even born. If you're someone who loves the deep history behind the cars that shaped drag racing as we know it today, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, to make sense of any of this, you have to understand what drag racing looked like before Dick Landy started doing what he did. In the early 1960s, the door slammer side of the sport was built almost entirely on factory steel. Detroit was sending these big production cars down to the strips with stock wheelbases, stock body lines, stock everything, and then layering on hotter engines and lighter trim. Super stock in particular was supposed to be a class where the cars looked basically like what your neighbor was driving home from work. The fans wanted it that way. The factories wanted it that way because they were selling cars to those fans on Monday mornings. Everybody had basically agreed that a stock car body was the thing that made it a stock car. Move the wheels and you weren't a stocker anymore. You were something else. Maybe a dragster, maybe a gasser, but not a stocker. That was the rule. That was the look. That was the world. The other thing you need to understand is that in 1962, 1963, and 1964, the engines had run away from the tires. Chrysler had the Max Wedge, then the brand new 426 race Hemi. Ford had the SOHC Camry coming. Chevy had the ZL1 mystery engine. These were factory engines making real numbers, and they were bolted into cars riding on bias-ply tires that simply could not put the power down. So you'd watch a super stock pair of cars launch, and it would look more like a smoke show than a race, because both of them would just light up the rears and sit there spinning until somebody actually started moving forward. The whole sport had a traction problem, and nobody had figured out how to solve it without breaking what made the cars look like cars in the first place. Dick Landy figured it out. The way he figured it out is the story. Here's what most people don't realize about Dick Landy. Before he became the guy in the white jacket with the unlit cigar, before he became Dandy Dick, before he became one of the 4 founding fathers of pro stock, he was a farm country kid from the San Fernando Valley who had studied mechanical engineering at a junior college and was building marine engines for water ski boats during the week to pay his bills. Richard Joseph Landy was born March 15, 1937, and he grew up back when the San Fernando Valley meant orange groves and dirt roads and deserted airstrips more than it meant Hollywood backlots. By the time he was 19 years old in 1956, he was running at San Fernando Raceway. His first competitive vehicle was a borrowed 1956 Ford pickup truck because his local strip ran a class for pickup. He moved up to a 1932 Flathead Ford after that. And then in 1960, his brother bought a new Ford with the Police Interceptor 352, and Dick started running that. By 1961, he had opened up his first speed shop, calling it automotive research right there in the valley, and he had picked up sponsorship from Andy Andrews of Van Nuys, who at the time was one of the biggest Ford performance dealers on the West Coast. Andrews is the guy who in 1961 stuck the first cigar in Landy's mouth as a victory celebration after a win, and the cigar never really left after that. Andrews is also the guy who pushed the white shirts and the clean-cut look. Landy explained it years later this way. Back in those days, drivers just wore their greasy t-shirts and grimy jeans to the races. Nobody really thought much about their appearance, but Andrews could see that drag racing was trying to be seen as a professional sport, and that how they presented themselves had an effect on how the fans accepted them. So Landy showed up to the strip looking like he was going to a wedding, and the cigar he never lit. Eric Dahlquist over at Hot Rod magazine saw the white outfit and the cigar and the fastidious car prep and tagged him with the nickname Dandy Dick in 1964. And that was that. Landy himself in a Hot Rod interview a few years later put it like this. He said he'd lit them for a joke but didn't smoke them. He'd just chew on them and throw them away. He'd chew through about a box a week when he was racing. He said he actually felt naked without one. Now, here's where the story turns. In 1962, Chrysler rolled out the 413 Max Wedge Cross Ram. Landy was racing a Ford. He looked at what Chrysler was doing. He looked at what was coming. And he did something that took some guts. He switched mid-season. He picked up a 1962 Plymouth Super stock car. And right around that time, Ronnie Householder, who ran Chrysler's competition projects out of Detroit, took notice and gave him a direct factory contract. From 1962 forward, Dick Landy was a Mopar racer, and that is the partnership that made everything else possible. He ran a 413 Plymouth in 1962, then a 1963 Plymouth with the aluminum front end. By 1964, the new 426 race Hemi was ready, and Landy got one of the factory-built 1964 Dodge 332-door sedans. These were the A864 lightweights, aluminum hood, aluminum front fenders, aluminum bumpers, acid-dipped where they could get away with it. The factory built exactly 55 of these in the spring of 1964, along with 55 matching Plymouth Savoy and Belvedere lightweight. Landy's car was scheduled to be built on May 27, 1964. He took delivery, picked it up, shook it down, and on July 11, 1964, at Lyons Dragstrip in Long Beach, he ran an 11.14 in the quarter. That was the track record. Then in November, he took it to San Fernando Raceway and became the first stocker in history to crack 130 miles per hour through the light. Pretty fantastic numbers for a car that had to look like a Dodge sedan. As Landy described it later in a Hot Rod sit-down with John Diana in 1969, the development work was endless and he traveled many towing miles that year. But he was learning the engine. He was figuring out what the Hemi wanted. And then, in the fall of 1964, he did the thing that started everything. He had been match racing the 1964 Dodge in NHRA Superstock, a trim which meant the car had to stay basically stock under the chassis. He decided he wanted to run match races where the rules were looser. So he took the car back to the shop, pulled the front suspension, and bolted in a solid front axle out of a Dodge A100 van. While he was at it, he moved the front wheels 6 inches forward. Then he relocated the leaf spring hangers in the rear and pulled the rear axle 8 inches forward. He had read what the Ram Chargers and a few other Mopar guys were doing with weight transfer, and he wanted to push it further. The result was a 1964 Dodge 330 with both axles shoved forward and a body that looked like somebody had drawn it badly on a napkin. The first time the converted car ran in public was the NHRA Winter Nationals at Phoenix on January 29 through 31, 1965, and it was running 10.60 seconds at almost 130 miles per hour. That car right there is the prototype. That car is the one that was telling Chrysler something the rest of the racing world hadn't figured out yet. The 1964 Dodge, by the way, still exists. It lives at the Museum of American Speed in Lincoln, Nebraska, where you can go look at it today. Chrysler did figure it out. Late in 1964, the engineers and the racing brass in Detroit decided they were going all in on the idea Landy had stumbled onto. 11 cars were pulled from the Los Angeles assembly plant, 6 Dodge Coronets and 5 Plymouth. 7 of the 11 were sent over to a coach builder called Amble Wagon in Troy, Michigan to get the wheelbase modifications done. Some accounts put the total Chrysler-supported number at 13 cars when you count Bill Flynn's sedan, which was modified separately by Dick Branster. Either way, these were the original altered wheelbase factory experimentals, and Dick Landy got one of the Coronet. The numbers on this car are genuinely wild, and this is where it gets really interesting. Front wheels forward 10 inches. Rear wheels forward 15 inches. Final wheelbase of 110 inches. Special torsion bars 9 inches longer than stock to clear the new front geometry. A stainless steel front K-member that came in 25 pounds lighter than the standard piece. Fiberglass for the hood, the doors, the fenders, the deck lid, even the instrument panel. Plexiglass windows. A bucket seat lifted out of an A100 van. And then, because Chrysler wasn't done yet, the body shells got chemical milled, acid dip. Landy supervised that part personally at a place called Automation Industries in Southern California, which was an aerospace metal finisher. He told the story years later to a writer named Cliff Gromer in 1990. The first body got dipped during the daytime, and it sent up a huge yellowish-red cloud of ferrous oxide into the sky. The neighbors started calling, so they did the rest of the bodies at night when the cloud wasn't so obvious. Landy's car got an extra step that none of the others got. After the acid bath, his went through a baking soda neutralization. That is the only reason that particular shell survived intact. The other altered wheelbase cars got eaten alive by their own corrosion in the years afterward. Landy's didn't. The end product had a weight bias of about 56% on the rear and 44% on the front. Now look. That number is the whole game. That number is why the car ran. Because here's the thing about the car looking wrong and running right. The reason a 1965 Coronet looks correct to your eye is that you have an idea of where the wheels go relative to the body. Move the wheels and the same body looks broken. But the body doesn't make a car go fast. The chassis makes the car go fast. And what Landy and the Chrysler engineers had figured out was that if you move the wheels forward without moving the engine forward, you shift the static weight rearward onto the drive tires. Then, when you launch, the dynamic weight transfer piles even more weight back onto those tires. Suddenly those bias-ply slicks that had been melting all over the launch pad now had real weight pinning them to the asphalt. They could hook. They could put the power down. The Hemi could finally do what the Hemi wanted to do. The side effect that everybody noticed first was that the car would rotate up onto its rear bumper at launch and ride the wheel stand for car lengths down the track. That was the visual that sold tickets. But the wheel stand wasn't the goal. The wheel stand was just what happened when you finally let a 426 race Hemi connect with the ground. Landy himself put it perfectly years later. He said Chrysler's altered wheelbase plan was a lot more effective than the new Ford engine because the biggest problem was traction. They could make their cars hook up a lot better, and the extra power of the Fords just compounded their traction problems. Ford had built the SOHC camber to win the horsepower argument. Chrysler had reorganized where the wheels went. Chrysler won. Now, you might be thinking, if this works so obviously, why hadn't anyone done it before? Here's the thing. The answer is cultural as much as it is mechanical. The whole identity of superstock was wrapped up in the idea that the cars had to look like production vehicles. There was a genuine fear in the sport that if the cars stopped looking like the things in dealer showrooms, the manufacturers would pull their money and the fans would lose interest. The altered wheelbase cars blew that assumption apart and proved that the fans didn't want showroom stock. They wanted a show. and a 3,000-pound Dodge Coronet standing straight up on its rear bumper at 143 miles per hour was absolutely a show. The car ran 9.52 at 143 miles per hour at its best in 1965. At Bakersfield, Landy won Top Stock Eliminator with a 10.28 at 138. Across the season match racing all over the country, he claims a record of 39 wins out of 40 outings. Some sources say 38. The 39 number is the cleaner one and the one most contemporary accounts back up. Landy's Coronet doing wheelies down the strip at every drag strip from Maine to California became one of those images that got into Hot Rod and Carcraft and Superstock and Drag Illustrated month after month. The LA Times wrote about it and described the launch perfectly. They said the Coronet would rear back on its bumper with its front wheels pawing at the air like a horse trying to throw its rider. NHRA hated it. NHRA looked at these cars and decided they were not super stocks anymore. They imposed a rule that limited wheelbase alteration to 2%, and that effectively kicked the entire altered wheelbase program out of any NHRA Superstock or AFX class competition. NHRA, the rival sanctioning body, was happy to take them. NHRA created a class called Ultra Stock and let them run. So in 1965, if you wanted to see Landy run his Coronet, you went to an NHRA event or you went to one of the hundreds of independent match races that were running every weekend across the country. Landy understood exactly what he had. He talked about it in a drag sport piece in 1965, saying that direct factory sponsorship draws people on its own strength, people who otherwise wouldn't come. He pointed out that all the dragsters were starting to look alike. It was very hard to tell who was who when they came to the starting line. If the spectators couldn't identify with something on the car or with the people who owned or drove it, they were going to lose interest. He understood that the car had to be the show, and his Coronet was the show. For 1966, the factory wanted to push further. Landy switched to a Dodge Dart sedan, stretched the nose, put a square tube frame under it, set the engine back, and the whole thing weighed somewhere around 1,700 pounds. He started with Hillborn fuel injection, and then mid-season Chrysler had him bolt on a Roots supercharger. The car ran 8.22 at 188 miles per hour. That is no longer a door slammer. That is a funny car. The whole class of funny car as we understand it today was getting born right then in 1966, and Landy's Dart was one of the cars that helped birth it. But it was also getting dangerous. Late that year, Landy was at Raisin City Raceway in Central California testing supercharged engines for Chrysler when his transmission exploded. The fire burned his foot. He limped back to the pits. The Mopar racing boss, Bob Cahill, came over and looked at the car and said something that pretty much ended Landy's funny car era right there on the spot. He said, "We don't sell these types of cars. Maybe we should try something else." Landy agreed. He told Bob McClurg later that after running the blown motors, they realized that going those speeds with the tires they had was unsafe. So they had a big meeting back in Detroit and the decision came down. Go back to Superstock. And while you're at it, teach America how to do this properly. That was the birth of the Dodge Performance Clinic. From 1967 through 1970, Landy and Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin spent half their lives traveling from Dodge dealership to Dodge dealership all over the country, putting on what were essentially seminars for racers, customers, and dealers. They'd talk through Hemi tuning. They'd answer questions. They'd hand out literature. Landy described the change to National Dragster years later. It was quite a change, switching from nitromethane and fire protective clothing to the suits and ties they wore at the clinic. But it was still a great way to make a living. They'd travel all over the country to the various Dodge dealerships, speaking to as many as 75,000 racing enthusiasts a year. The clinics ran 4 years. Landy was good at this part too. The white outfit and the unlit cigar that had been a starting line act became a corporate ambassador act, and Chrysler got their money's worth out of him. He kept racing the whole time. In 1968, He won the NHRA Winter Nationals in his '68 Charger running a 10.49 at 133.25. He won 21 of 26 dual races that season. He picked up the Carcraft All-Star Drag Racing Award. His brother Mike joined the team to drive the team's 1968 Coronet R/T. At the 1968 NHRA Winter Nationals at Pomona, Landy ran 3 cars. Mike in the SS/DA Coronet, Butch Leal in a Landy prepped '68 Coronet in SS/FA, and Dick himself in SS/EA in a 1968 Dart 440. Dick beat Gas Ronda's '68 Cobra Jet Mustang in the SS/EA class final, 12.01 to 12.02, a margin of 1/100th of a second. He ran a 1969B modified production Charger with a 440 wedge they called the Flying Wedge, and that won one modified production at the 1969 Winter Nationals. Now, here's what most people don't realize about where Landy's head was at during this period. He wasn't just racing. He was thinking about what drag racing needed to become. He was watching the handicap starts and the bracket systems and the confusion on the spectator side of the fence, and he was thinking about a cleaner answer. And that thinking led directly to the most important thing he ever did for the sport, something that had nothing to do with moving wheels forward or running wheel stands. In late 1969, Landy sat down with Ronnie Sox and Bill Jenkins and Don Nicholson, and the 4 of them worked out a rules formula they took to NHRA. The idea was simple. Heads-up door slammer racing, stock frames, factory bodies, a weight-to-displacement formula of 7 pounds per cubic inch, which meant a 426 Hemi was carrying around 3,000 pounds. No more handicap starts, no more brackets, no more calculating. Whoever crossed the line first won, period. NHRA agreed. The class was called Pro Stock, and the first NHRA Pro Stock race in history was the 1970 Winter Nationals at Pomona. The 4 guys who designed that class became known later as the founding fathers of Pro Stock. Dick Landy is one of them, and that is a piece of his legacy that genuinely doesn't get talked about enough. The whole modern Pro Stock category, every heads-up door slammer race you have ever watched, traces back to a meeting that included him. Think about that for a second. The guy who in 1965 was being laughed at in the pits for building a car that looked broken sat down 4 years later and helped design the rulebook for the most technically demanding production-based drag racing class in history. That is an arc. For 1970, he ran a 2-car team, a 1970 Hemi Challenger for himself and a 1970 Hemi Dart for Bob Lambic. He explained the choice to Super Stock and Drag Illustrated this way. The center of gravity is down quite a bit in the Challenger and it comes out better without going straight up. It wants to go forward. If the Dart would go faster, he'd have it with him at the major races. Factory pressure is one thing, he said, but you've got to try to win races. He qualified 4th at the Winter Nationals at 10.11. He red-lit in the semis against Jenkins. The whole season was building toward the second NHRA Pro Stock National event of the year, and that brings us to the moment that everything else in this story has been pulling toward. This is the climax. July 18th and 19th, 1970. York, U.S. 30 Dragway in Pennsylvania. The first ever NHRA Summer Nationals. 16-car Pro Stock field. Bump spot at 10.19. Dick Oldfield qualifies number 1 in the Motown Missile at 9.93. Landy works his way through the bracket in his Hemi Challenger, the white outfit, the unlit cigar, the pressed jacket still somehow clean after a full day of racing in the Pennsylvania summer heat. By the final round, the matchup is Dick Landy versus Herb McCandless in the Sox and Martin 1970 Plymouth Hemi Duster. McCandless was a fast driver in arguably the better car from arguably the better team, and McCandless himself said years later that he had Landy covered on that run. Here is McCandless's own version of what happened, told to the Sox and Martin website years afterward. He'll never forget that race. He red-lit to Landy at the first NHRA national event in York. It was the finals and he had him covered. Had he not gone red, he would have won his first major event in pro stock. Here's what really made it sting for McCandless. Landy missed a gear on that run. Think about that. Landy missed a gear. The car didn't run its best number. McCandless redlit before the tree even came down. And Dick Landy in the white jacket with the unlit cigar collected the win. The first pro stock win in Dodge history at an NHRA event. Look, the exact final round elapsed times don't show up in the NHRA online archive, and as best my research has informed me, the period National Dragster issue is the only place those numbers were ever published. But it doesn't matter. The man who 4 years earlier had been told by Chrysler to put the supercharged car away and go teach dealership clinics had just won the first major pro stock race in his class for his manufacturer. The wrong-looking cars from 1965 had built the right-looking ones from 1970. And the guy in the white jacket had carried the whole story all the way through. He didn't stop there. The 1971 Challenger picked up rack and pinion steering off of all things, a UK-built Plymouth Cricket, and ran 9.60 at 145.30. The 1972 Challenger debuted the tricolor red, white, and blue paint that became the iconic Landy livery, the look that most people today associate with his name when they picture his cars. At the 1972 NHRA Summer Nationals at Englishtown, New Jersey on July 16, Landy made it to the pro stock final again. This time he met Bill Grumpy Jenkins and Jenkins's brand new small block Vega, which was running a 331 cubic inch motor in the class's first tube chassis car. Jenkins won. That was Landy's second and final NHRA pro stock final round appearance. Now, you might be thinking, if the story peaks at York in 1970 and then Landy loses at Englishtown in 1972, is the rest of the career just a long decline? No. Not even close. Because what happens between 1973 and 1981 is one of the most interesting chapters in the whole thing. For 1973, Landy commissioned a brand new car from Kent Fuller, one of the best chassis builders in the country. A 1973 Dart Sport on a Kent Fuller chassis with a Hemi that he had destroked using a Moldex crank and a 4.210-inch bore, so he could get a better weight brake under NHRA's formula while keeping most of the power. 13.5 to 1 compression. Mickey Thompson aluminum rods. A crane roller cam. Twin Holly 641 Dominators on a tunnel ram. Super mag ignition. Dry sump oiling. 2.25-inch hooker headers. NHRA legal weight of 2,575 pounds. Build cost of $32,000 in 1973 money, which was a serious fortune. The car ran 9 flat at 150 with a Mopar 4-speed because Landy didn't trust the Lenco transmissions yet. He won the 1973 NHRA Pro Stock World Championship with that car, beating Larry Huff, who was running an identical Landy-built piece, by 1,500 points. Some sources also list him as a 1974 NHRA Pro Stock World Champion. But as best my research has informed me, that 1974 attribution is contradicted by the more authoritative accounts which have Landy running NHRA Superstock that year during Chrysler's NHRA boycott. So 1973 NHRA solid. 1974 hedge carefully. The boycott year did produce one more piece of brilliance worth understanding. For 1974 NHRA Superstock drag racing, Landy built a 1970 Challenger with a 426 Street Hemi backed by a 4-speed and used the lightweight TA-scooped fiberglass hood. He won the 1974 Gator Nationals SS/D class with that car and set the SS/D class record at 10.55. He later restored that boycott Challenger himself and drove it at the 2001 Goodwood Festival of Speed in England, which is one of those details that makes you appreciate how much the Europeans had come to understand what American muscle cars meant to motorsport history. Here was a guy in his mid-60s, climbing into a car he had built and raced 27 years earlier, taking it down a British Hilclimb course in front of a crowd that gave him a genuine reception. By the late 1970s, the racing economics started catching up with him. He bought back the second Dart Sport that he had built originally for Larry Huff and ran it through 1977 in the low 8.70s at 157 plus. Good numbers, but the class was evolving fast. The tube chassis cars and the small block engines were rewriting what was competitive, and the Hemi, for all its reputation and history, was becoming a disadvantage under the rulebook rather than an advantage. Then in 1979, Landy made one last push with a Dodge Omni 024 Pro Stocker on a Don Hardy chassis, running a 341 cubic inch small block instead of a Hemi because the Hemi rules had finally made the engine uncompetitive in Pro Stock. Landy reworked everything on that small block. Changed the lifter bore angles in the block from 116 degrees to 110 degrees. Reworked the W2 heads completely. The engine would spin to 11,300 revolutions per minute. Best run was 8.42 at 161 plus. Brad Yulke drove it for a while. Then Kenny Duttweiler. Then in 1981, Landy parked it. He explained the decision plainly in an interview from that period. When Glidden did so well with his Aero, NHRA took another half-pound off the Fords and gave it to the Mopars. That was when he quit for good. He was sick of fighting a rulebook that kept moving the target. For context, what he was talking about was Bob Glidden, who in 1979 retired his undefeated Fairmont and switched to a Plymouth Aero, losing only 3 times all year while winning 7 national events and his 3rd straight Winston Pro Stock World Championship. NHRA's response to Glidden running away with everything was to adjust the weight brakes again. And that finally did it for Landy. He was 44 years old. He had been racing factory Mopars for almost 20 years. He sold the Omni to Paul Gentilozzi and walked away from the wheel. But here's the thing, and this is a point that gets missed in most retellings of the Landy story. He didn't walk away from the sport. He didn't cash out and disappear. He turned the page to the next chapter, which turned out to be just as consequential in its own way. Dick Landy Industries had been running out of Northridge, California since 1970, and from 1981 forward, DLI became a full-time engine shop. Landy built Hemis for everybody. He built the engine in Roy Hill's 1984 Mercury Capri Pro Stock car. He built engines for Reed Wisnet and for Bassett Racing's Pro Stock Dodge Omni. He produced 426 Hemi crate engines at 10-to-1 and 9-to-1 compression for street use. He developed a 484 cubic inch stroker variant that became one of the most respected street Hemi builds available anywhere in the country at the time. He kept teaching too. From the mid-1990s until his death, he wrote a technical column for West Coast Mopar Muscle magazine. Anybody with a Hemi in California eventually ended up at his door. The white jacket was gone by this point, replaced by a DLI shop shirt, but the unlit cigar was still there, and the instinct for engineering was exactly what it had always been. He had one more wild project in him. His brother Mike came in on it. Mike Landy by this point was a Hemi engine guru in his own right, and the two of them worked on a Bonneville streamliner called Flatfire, which was Ron Main's Ford flathead-powered land speed car. The Flatfire became the first flathead-powered car in history to set a record over 300 miles per hour. The number was 302.674 miles per hour. According to CarBuzz and Torque Talk, 2 Landy brothers from the San Fernando Valley, who had grown up watching their dad's friends race flathead Fords on dry lakes, had just put a flathead Ford engine into the 300-mile-per-hour club. The actual run was August of 2003. Think about what that means in the context of the whole arc. In 1956, Dick Landy had been running a borrowed pickup truck at San Fernando Raceway. In 2003, he and his brother were running a flathead-powered streamliner at 302 miles per hour on the Bonneville Salt Flat. That is a life in motorsport. He also built the 440 wedge that powered the legendary Yates, Needham, and McClure Chaos Transcon jet-powered ambulance, which is one of those drag racing oddities that deserves its own video entirely and will absolutely be getting one on this channel. By the mid-2000s, Landy's health had been declining for a while. He kept showing up though. In July of 2006, he made an appearance at the All Chrysler Nationals in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which was one of his last public outings. He kept writing his column right up to the end. Then on January 11, 2007, at 9:35 in the evening, he died of kidney failure at age 69. The memorial was held a week later in Mission Hills, California. He is buried at the San Fernando Mission Cemetery, a few miles from where he started running pickups at San Fernando Raceway as a 19-year-old in 1956. He left behind his wife Jeannie, his sons Robert and Richard, his daughter Danette, and his brother Mike. Mike kept the engine work going for a while afterward. Then Mike himself died in October of 2025. Dick Landy Industries closed shortly after Dick's death. The family has been clear that DLI was closed, not sold, and they have noted publicly that there have been unauthorized uses of the Dick Landy and DLI names floating around since then. So if you see DLI-labeled merchandise or services out there, treat that with serious caution. The men who ran the shop are gone. What's left is the cars, the records, and the photograph. The cars are still around if you know where to look. The 1964 Dodge 330, the prototype of everything, the first car Landy ever moved an axle on, is at the Museum of American Speed in Lincoln, Nebraska, where you can go stand next to it and try to picture a 19-year-old from the San Fernando Valley looking at it in a shop and deciding to pull the front suspension out and bolt in a van axle. The 1965 altered wheelbase Coronet, the most famous Landy car of all, the one that ran the 9.52 at 143 that started this whole video, went through the Bev Smith Factory Lightweights collection and crossed the block at Mecum Kissimmee in January 2018, where it hit a high bid of $500,000 and didn't sell at that number. The 1971 Era Pro Stock Challenger and the 1974 Boycott car both ended up in the Todd Werner collection and went through Mecum Harrisburg in 2019. The 1979 Omni went to Paul Gentilozzi. These cars are out there. They're in collections and museums and private garages, and every single one of them carries a piece of the story we've been tracing since that first paragraph. Now, back to the question that has been hanging over this whole story since the very beginning. How did a guy whose cars looked physically wrong end up redefining what fast meant in American drag racing? The answer turns out to be pretty simple in retrospect, and that simplicity is actually what makes it so interesting. Landy understood that the visual language of a stock car had nothing to do with whether the car could put power to the ground. The 56% rear weight bias was the whole game. Move the wheels forward and the picture broke, but the physics worked. He had the engineering instinct to see that distinction when almost nobody else in the sport was looking at it that way. He had the factory backing to build it into something real. He had the showmanship to sell it to the fans and the press. And he had the discipline to keep his white jacket pressed for 20 years while everybody around him was wearing greasy t-shirts and not thinking much about their appearance. Here's what most people don't realize when they look at the Landy story from a distance. The altered wheelbase cars and the pro stock cars and the NHRA championship and the York win are all connected to the same original insight, which is that the conventional answer is usually not the only answer. The whole sport had agreed on where the wheels went. Landy didn't. The whole sport had agreed that bracket racing with handicap starts was how you ran production-based cars. Landy and Jenkins and Sox and Nicholson said no, heads up, first one to the finish line wins, and built a class around that instead. Every time the conventional wisdom said this is how it works, Landy found a reason to look at it differently. That is actually a very unusual quality in a sport where the successful formula tends to get copied and calcified very quickly. Look, the cigar made him a character. The Coronet made him a pioneer. The performance clinics made him a manufacturer's ambassador. The York Pro Stock win made him a national champion. The 1973 NHRA title made it official. The flat fire run at 302 miles per hour on the Salt Flats with his brother in 2003 was the last reminder that the kid from San Fernando, who had taken a Dodge van axle and bolted it into a 1964 Hemi Coronet, was always going to be the guy who looked at the conventional answer and tried something that made more sense to him. This is where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective, because the things Landy built and the class he helped design and the cars he tuned for other people are all still influencing what happens at drag strips today. Pro Stock as a class exists because of that meeting in 1969. The concept of weight transfer optimization that he pushed to its logical limit in 1965 is now foundational knowledge in every form of drag racing from bracket to pro. He didn't just race. He actually moved things forward, sometimes literally by relocating an axle, and sometimes figuratively by sitting down with a legal pad and designing a rulebook. And here is the final thing worth saying about all of this. The wrong-looking cars ran right because Dick Landy understood something most of his contemporaries didn't quite grasp, which is that the car doesn't have to look correct. It just has to win. The picture on the outside is for the fans. The physics on the inside is for the stopwatch. Landy knew the difference between those two things, and he used that knowledge better than almost anyone in his era. His cars won at quarter-mile tracks from Long Beach to Pennsylvania. His engines won in other people's cars long after he stopped driving. His rulebook is still being raced under in some form more than 50 years later. That is a legacy in the fullest sense of the word. Wherever Dick Landy is right now, I'm guessing the cigar is still unlit and the white jacket is still pressed. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, hit that thumbs up button because it genuinely helps this channel reach people who care about this kind of history, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We have a lot more of these to get through.